Hi there, and welcome to this channel where I talk about my first-hand experience with eating disorders, but also about basically anything else that's even remotely related to eating disorders. I'm sure it goes without saying that these topics can be triggering to someone, to say the least, who is currently struggling with an eating disorder or has dealt with them in the past. So if you feel like you're not in the headspace to hear about, for example, childhood trauma, suicide ideation, depression, sexual trauma, self-harm, or just about eating disorders in general, this video is not going to be for you. Please kindly find something else to watch and maybe come back later when you feel more prepared to engage with this type of content. On top of that sort of trigger warning, I'd like to clarify that I won't be showing photos of my emaciated self on this channel. I'm not here to try to validate my past sickness, and I think it's crucial that we don't keep perpetuating the stereotypical anorexic look, because eating disorders really don't have a specific look, and this is why how the media and social media portray eating disorders can be a very invalidating experience for you if you don't look the part, so to speak. In addition, I'd like to discourage people from clicking on eating disorder related content solely to trigger themselves. I won't enable you to hurt yourself. I'm actually here to try to convince you to do the opposite. I'm here to try to convince you to heal yourself. I'm sure you can tell that we are about to delve into a very vulnerable topic. At least it feels very vulnerable to me. And this is precisely why I think that talking about eating disorders from a male perspective is crucial, because eating disorders are still perceived as something feminine, something that girls do, quote unquote, out of vanity or whatever, which could not be farther from the truth. I guess what I'm trying to say here is it can be a very invalidating and emasculating experience for a guy to struggle with something that only girls are supposed to struggle with. So let me try to explain why and how I developed an eating disorder. It's actually quite common that after experiencing some kind of childhood trauma, people will develop an eating disorder or some kind of other type of mental health issue later in life. And I can confirm that I am no stranger to some childhood trauma. Some of this trauma was religious in nature, since I grew up in a very strictly religious environment, but I was also subjected to some pretty severe emotional neglect and abuse. Growing up in this, I would say, overly religious environment was unfortunate for me, to say the least, because I knew that I was gay by the time I was 3. I didn't know back then that this was something you were not supposed to be, or this was something that others frowned upon, but I quickly had to find out that this was the case. In addition to having to wrestle with my sexual orientation or just with my identity in general, I was also relentlessly bullied by my peers. And when I say relentlessly, I mean all day, every day. I was bullied for basically anything and everything. I was bullied for being religious, for being a straight-A student, for being feminine, for having a high-pitched voice, for looking the way I looked, for speaking with a burr. Basically, if I tried to breathe wrong, at least it felt like that, I could expect some kind of retaliation from my peers. And one day, the kids at school decided that it was time to start calling me a faggot. I mean, technically they were not wrong about my orientation, but hearing other people calling me a faggot after learning how society thinks about LGBTQ plus folks was just mortifying to me. This concept or idea that someone can look at me, and tell that I was gay was just terrifying to me. I was simply dreading the day when my parents would find out about this, because I was just convinced that that would be the day when they disown me. I was around 9 or 10 when this started happening, and I spent basically the next decade living with this existential dread. I quickly developed an immense shame about basically every part of my being, not just about my sexuality, And because of this shame, I withdrew from the world and spent all of my time living in my head in this sort of echo chamber that was populated by the abusive voices of people around me and the voice of a vengeful God who would, after I died, send me to a place that's even hotter than gay people. Things got so bad for me that I basically cried myself to sleep on most nights. On one hand, because of the daily abuse I had to endure, but on the other hand, because of the internalized homophobia and because of how I perceived myself due to this internalized homophobia. Can you believe that I was praying to this God, asking him to kill me if I ever dare to touch another man? And when I say touch, I don't mean it that way. I was just trying so hard to suppress this part of me, to somehow make myself smaller, just to fit into a mold, fit into some kind of mold that was deemed more acceptable by society. And at the same time, I was just so determined not to let others see that they could get to me, not to let them see that the bullying hurt. And even though I was just a kid who didn't have the necessary tools or support system in place to deal with the situation, I'd like to highlight this decision of me, this decision of numbing myself to the pain and dissociating myself from my emotions, because, man, it will come back later in life and bite me in the ass so hard. As a result of growing up in this environment, I quickly became depressed, then suicidal. Fast forward to my early 20s, now I'm severely depressed and suicidal. Luckily, my friends noticed that something was off, and they convinced me to go and see a therapist. And this therapist's office is the safe space where I come out for the first time in my life. And I made a big mistake here because I left therapy way too early. These sessions were about me trying to work up the courage to come out to my closest friends and eventually to my family. We didn't even try to touch on any of my past trauma or unpack any of it. So I just carried on, still carrying all that pain, still not knowing how to feel my own emotions because I had just become so out of touch with them. Thanks to these therapy sessions, I eventually managed to first come out to my friends and then to my family. The reception, as you can guess, was mixed, to say the least. On one hand, it was just so liberating to finally be out, but at the same time, at times, this whole experience was frustrating and even painful. I actually lost friendships over this, and I didn't necessarily feel that I was receiving the kind of support that I needed back then. Regardless, I was out now, so dating for the very first time in my life had become a real possibility for me. Actually, I tried to date girls prior to this, but I was just mostly trying to avoid dating altogether, if you know what I mean. So I registered on a few of these dating websites that were geared toward gay people, and I quickly had to realize that the body I was existing in and the body I already hated and I was insecure about just simply didn't live up to the gay beauty standards. So I needed a fix for that. I needed a fix for this, and I felt like I needed that like right then. And as a fix, I started watching what I ate and I started exercising regularly, which in itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but if I decided back then that I was doing something, I had to take it to the extreme. I had to do it perfectly, otherwise it didn't count. Perfectionism is another thing that I would like to highlight here because it's a personality trait that can make you prone to developing an eating disorder. Back in the day, if I couldn't do something perfectly, that just felt like a confirmation of what the voices in my head always told me. I'm talking about the voices that I internalized as a child, and then these voices became my sort of inner critic, a very fierce, cruel, and unforgiving inner critic. And according to my inner critic, I was basically a sinful little bitch. I was dirty, I was unworthy and undeserving. Undeserving of love, undeserving of happiness, undeserving even to take up space in this world. I learned to hate myself so much during the decade that I felt like I was the dirt on the bottom of other people's shoes. So there was a pretty big disconnect here for me, because on the surface I tried to make it look like I was happy now, I was leading a healthy lifestyle and I was ready to be in a relationship with someone. But actually on the inside I was going through a crisis. First of all, I was not even remotely ready to be in a relationship with someone because I was just so terrified of physical intimacy. I felt like I was still covered in this dirt that would somehow transfer to the other person or somehow infect them if they ever try to touch me. On the other hand, all of the methods that I previously used to avoid acknowledging my emotions suddenly stopped working. So to keep myself numb to my own emotions and to keep myself out of touch with my inner world, I started exercising compulsively, and I just became obsessed with healthy eating and with healthy living in general. Needless to say, it was anything but healthy. I don't think that at this point I had a full-blown eating disorder, but I definitely had some very disordered eating and exercise habits. Things really started to spiral out of control for me when I moved to a new place where I basically didn't know anyone. Even though I made a half-hearted attempt at socializing, there was barely anyone around me, which just made hiding the eating disorder behaviors that I was developing much more effortless. And when the few people around me started expressing their concerns regarding my exercise and eating habits and my weight, I decided that it was time to push those people away as well. Once again, I found myself alone and isolated, living in my head in the same echo chamber that was filled with all the derogatory, demeaning thoughts and opinions that I have ever heard and had about myself. It was like watching this abuse movie, but with your mind's eye. Sort of 24/7 abuse movie that consisted of all your past mistakes and regrets. And if you're a person who is struggling with an eating disorder and perfectionism at the same time, oh boy, you do have a lot of past regrets, because nothing you have ever done was good enough. And this is essentially how my eating disorder self was born. Although it served a multitude of purposes, on one hand I needed to push these things out of my mind and just silence the internal self-abuse, and at the same time I also needed to keep myself distracted from all the unprocessed feelings that I never allowed myself to feel, because even though I did not allow myself to feel them, somehow I was aware that there was all this pain welled up inside of me, and if I didn't keep some kind of protective barrier between all the pain and myself, it would just break free and wash over me, and it would just drown me. As I forced my body to shrink to an unhealthy size, it seemed like my whole life had become something impossibly small and suffocating. Food and exercise was all I thought about. That was all my life was about. And instead of consuming the food, these obsessive thoughts revolving around food started to consume me. All I was thinking about was food and the calorie content of the food that I wasn't going to allow myself anyway. I was just making these endless plans regarding how and when do I get the food, and how and when would I prepare the small amount of food that I was allowing myself, and how could I maximize the time I spent with exercising, because I reached a point where I couldn't eat anything without exercising before or compensating for it after I ate it. And indeed, I spent most of my waking hours doing some form of exercise, often some made-up form of exercise, because even when I was at work, I just kept doing these micro movements to burn a few extra calories. And then I made a big mistake again. I was in my mid-20s and I was still terribly inexperienced with physical intimacy. And even though I had no libido whatsoever, I decided that it was time to lose my virginity. I'm not trying to imply that losing your virginity is a mistake, but losing it to a random guy from the internet and not telling them that it was my first time was a big mistake for me. It turned the whole encounter into something violating and traumatizing, and I had been driven over the edge by it. This whole experience had me convinced that I would never have a normal, fulfilling and healthy life. I would never be able to freely express or enjoy my sexuality. So all those years, all that decade that I spent on coming to terms with my own sexuality was just a fucking waste, and I should have just thrown my life away when I came really close to going through with it. The next part will probably sound dark, but don't worry, this is the only dark bit in this story. And I only realized this later, years later actually, when I was already in recovery. And what I realized that this was the last drop of trauma, if trauma is measured in drops. And this was when I decided that I was going to die of my eating disorder, which is the weirdest thing, because up until that point, I was just in absolute and complete denial about having an eating disorder. But somehow, some part of me acknowledging this, that this was going to happen, and this is how I would go out, just forced me to realize and admit that I had a problem. And admitting to myself that I had an eating disorder was actually the first step in my recovery. And I'm not going to talk about my recovery in detail in this video, but I think it's worth mentioning that what made me decide to recover and what kept me going in the early stages of recovery was that I became fucking pissed. I became furious. And I got furious because I looked back at my life and I realized that I spent most of it living in my own head, which was not a happy or healthy place to be, because I've been struggling with my mental health for the longest time. And I had been fighting these demons that for the most part were put there by other people, but these demons were living rent-free in my head, and they took away my childhood, and they made me waste my youth, while other people, at least seemingly, got to go about their business. And I felt like I was never given a chance to do that. I felt wrong because of that, and I felt if I were to die to my eating disorder, those people would have won, and I just couldn't have that. And this could sound twisted or backwards or whatever, but what I'm trying to say is I think that anger is a really underutilized emotion, and it can actually be used to achieve some kind of positive outcome. And even though I didn't feel or think that I deserved that chance I was talking about, I gave myself that chance. And I'm not trying to imply that recovery is just about giving yourself a chance, or recovery will happen just like that for you, because in most cases it just doesn't. Full transparency, recovery will take time. It's going to be painful, it's going to be messy, and you will likely have to make a mess out of it before it starts working. But when it starts working, it can also be the most rewarding thing that you have ever done in your life. So if you would like to see more of this content, just subscribe to the channel or interact with the video in any way you like. I hope you will have a great day, but if you are going through something difficult right now, I hope it will be at least a reasonable one.